Thank you. I've been looking forward to that for some time. This is like, I feel like it's a passage that one has to have in life at some point, to be introduced by Mark. And it was not too traumatic. It was, as far as the parentheses go, what can I say that's witty about that? Well, I suppose if they've been deparenthesized, that really tamps down my possibilities somewhat. It really has to be epistemological anarchy as opposed to anarchy altogether, which would allow me to run out the door. A very deep breath. I don't usually talk. I should clarify this by saying that my friends will say that I do talk a great deal. I love to talk one-on-one, especially on topics that I'm passionate about. The thing is that the topics that I'm passionate about are probably things I'm not supposed to talk about, which tends to be in the realm of history and philosophy of math and science. And being at Green College has been a very interesting, I'm not sure which term I should use, anthropological or sociological experience of discovering that there are different communities here. I find that there's one community that will run aghast from the room when I come up with a little running aphorism. I'll give an example. I was warming up a few minutes ago in my room, and the kinds of phrases that pop into my head will be very silly things like, facts are the rosary beads of the religion of logic. This is just something that, and I'll say something like that, and the people who are science-minded usually get quite afraid of me. And then the people who are in the humanities, usually the things that I say, they yawn and say, well, we've been talking about this for decades, where have you been? So in my defense, it has been more than 30 years since I was in academia. I'll explain this as we go along, how that is possible. I really am halfway through life, by my reckoning. And so I have thought about what I was going to talk about and how I would sequence it a huge number of times. And last week I was performing in Portugal, and there's a colleague of mine. We were playing the Beethoven Triple Concerto. And this cellist has decided that he's going to conduct, and so my pianist colleague and I, we teased him a certain amount, because it's very easy to critique somebody else's conducting, and I'm not going to, well, I just did, kind of like this. It's very easy to critique what somebody else does, but it's very difficult to do it yourself. And so the first thing that came to mind, being a kind of a computer science dork as I am at the time, was the P versus NP problem. Who is familiar with this, just out of curiosity? We have one person, okay. This is where I have to figure out like who's conversant in which domains. The P versus NP problem, which I will massacre now, but basically says that it's much easier to verify the solution to a problem than it is to find the solution to a problem. And watching this friend of mine conduct, kept parenthesizing our teasing by saying, but I don't want to try it and I couldn't do it as well as you. It just is easy to critique from a distance. In the same vein, I've come to many talks here, and I have been informed and I have been inspired, and frankly now, as of a few days, I realize that I'm somewhat intimidated because people make it look very easy. When I tried talking to an empty room, just in the last day or two, I discovered that it's very hard. And in fact, my brain goes very quickly, my mouth not so much so. There's a great number of things, there are a great number of things. There's a great number, sorry, that's singular. There is a great number of things that I would like to talk about, but I think I'd like for this to happen more as a conversation if possible. I know this is a little bit of a theoretical ideal. We do have the Q&A. I invite you to interrupt me. The challenge that one has, the N in the P versus NP problem is non-deterministic. And the idea is that if you had a computer that could follow all the possible paths at the same time, you'd be able to find the solution to various problems very quickly. The problem that I have is that I'd like to tell a lot of stories at the same time. And in the course of playing these, I've just given away what I'm going to do. In the course of playing this music, I find that I have wonderful inner monologues which go a different direction every time. And I toyed with this quite a few times. I debated whether one of the possibilities would be that I would play some music for you and have a presentation with a split screen that would show you different possible conversations that I'm having in my head while this music takes place. Technically, I haven't gone to that point yet. It may happen. Again, in my defense, I will say I checked this yesterday, that when I left school after the last degrees I had completed, PowerPoint had not yet been released in its first version. So I have never been part of the visual communicating world, and I'm quite happy, in fact, to stick up for the audio side of things. This will be an audio-only talk. I will try to sketch out where I'm planning to go. On the other hand, kind of the language of cinema and TV, I believe in the cold open. The cold open means that I'm going to play some music for you without too much introduction, and then while I'm playing that, I think I'll figure out how I'm going to explain to you the rest of what I intend for the talk. So, speaking of halfway through life, this weekend past I had a lovely drive out to Kelowna, which is a beautiful drive through the mountains, and went to the 90th birthday party of an old family friend. And I could go on irrelevant tangents, as I generally do, tell you more about the connection there. It was kind of a touching event because 30 or 40 relatives, and I'm not a member of the family by blood or marriage, but was warmly welcomed as a sort of pseudo-family member, and this connection goes back for a really long time. After dinner, part of my surprise to be there, because I hadn't announced that I was coming, was to play. There's a story in his family of violin playing since his ancestors emigrated during the First World War from the Ukraine. And so I asked him what he'd like me to play, and the first thing that he asked for was a Mozart concerto, which I dutifully played the first movement of, and I won't do that one for you because it requires an orchestra. In that context, I occasionally said orchestra, 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 which was kind of fine there, but I feel this is just a little bit too serious to do that. The second piece that he asked for happened to be the Bach G minor solo sonata, and that was a lucky choice. I mean, I have a pretty big repertoire, but that's a piece that I've played since I was a little kid. And moreover, during this term that I have been, whatever it is exactly that I am in residence at Green College, the biggest project that I've been involved in is a performance of the three, I don't know why I'm reading this, I know what they are, the three Bach solo sonatas, which is pretty unusual for me because it's actually only the second concert that I've ever performed playing just solo violin. I usually play with a pianist who accompanies me, or I play with orchestra. Over the years, I was often here in Vancouver playing with the symphony. In recent years, more often in chamber music, which is the thing that's closest to my heart, although it is probably the worst paid of all the above options. And so that was a project. It was kind of convenient that he should choose that because I was able to play that. And thus, in the spirit of the cold open, without too much further explanation, I'm going to start playing for you the first movement, maybe the first two movements of this. I have some program notes that I received from, did I explain where I was playing? It was the Gardner Museum. It's a very idiosyncratic little place in Boston that I've been playing there for 20 odd years. I checked my computer and it said I've been there 20 odd times also. So it's been a big part of my life. And they wrote some lovely program notes, and I will say this talk is not going to end up being a regular lecture recital where I tell you about the music. I figured that was a little too obvious. However, one of the stories that I'd like to tell is about the music. I'll explain a little bit more about the sonatas as a whole in a moment. There's one paragraph here where there's a metaphor that this writer, I don't know who he is, Paul Griffiths, he didn't come up to say hello after the concert, but he wrote a paragraph. I love the image at the end of this, and so I thought it was quite in keeping with various other themes that I hope to get to. So I'll read this here. My eyes are getting worse with age. I can just make this out. For each of the works, Bach chose a key that suits the violin's tuning, beginning with the tonality in which a full root position chord can sit lowest on the instrument, G minor, with the bottom two strings, G and D, open, that means not stopped, allowed to ring freely, and the upper two sounding B flat and again G. This chord, at once settled and taut, which is kind of how I feel right now myself, duly provides the doorway into the first sonata and even into the whole set of works. We can call it their elemental chord. It comes back at the end of the first phrase of the Adagio, which is what I'm going to play for you right now, in whose mind, I'm not sure if that was meant to be in the listener's mind, it's a bit confusing, in whose mind it remains along with other ideas, and it returns again to close the movement, and the phrase I like so much, the door in is the door out. This idea of returning to where you started, but not as the same person, is an image that I find really fascinating. Anyway, I haven't played in here. We're going to see how this feels. There's a little debate as to whether I should turn off the microphone. Shall we do a quick test? This is with the microphone. Seems okay. I'm going to let you choose. This is audience participation. This was supposed to turn off, but it apparently does not. Oh, the one above it. Green light. Okay, good. I'm back. Future listener. So as you see, it ends with the chord that it began with. And there's a couple of places which I think, I'll just mention one or two of the places that are my favorite in this piece. One is this point of ambiguity, a thing that shows up in several of the sonatas, and I'll point it out, I think, in each of these movements, is where Bach comes to a diminished chord, which is this wonderfully ambiguous symmetrical chord. It's a kind of a symmetrical by, it's the cyclic group of order 4 for anybody who's into math, okay. It's rotationally symmetric. Yes?
Any of the 4 components of the chord can be the root of the chord.
Exactly, exactly. And these are points that they're kind of like portals in video games or wormholes in the wildest dreams of cosmology now. There are these points where you can enter and you can go at any place somewhere else. One of them takes place, you might remember, where he lands on this chord and then he steps up to the diminished chord that's one step higher. Here, another observation that we'll find in many places is it's the consonance of the fifth. And it's a funny thing because as a performer, this is actually, as a violinist, it's a rather stressful thing to play a fifth because these are places where you have to play 2 strings and stop at the same note, essentially in the same position as measured by the offset from the scroll of the instrument. And it's very difficult to put your finger there. You spend a lifetime learning to put your finger in a proper position on a single string. And I was quite intrigued actually in this term when I was working on this repertoire that I almost had to relearn one aspect of the left hand of the violin, which was to learn these positions of putting the finger stably between strings. And it's very sensitive. There was a moment where I became curious in the way that I am with trivia and looked at what the sensitivity is with intonation. So a huge part of playing the violin is intonation. I had a teacher that I'll speak about later who used to say 90% of playing the violin is intonation. A great deal of the pleasure and pain of playing the instrument is intonation. I say pleasure because when you get a handle on it, or you get old enough that the acuity of your hearing decreases, which might also be what's happening, I'm not sure. Of late, I feel as though I finally got the hang of it. I'm not sure if that's really the case or if it just feels like that. Hitting these perfectly tuned intervals they're points of peace, they're points of rest, they're like fixed points for a dynamical system. There's a point where the system is perfectly balanced. And so after this diminished chord is one of these. I'm pointing this out at random. You'll find these fifths and octaves scattered throughout the Bach that I'm playing. They're points of punctuation. Right here. So here's a case where my second finger is very carefully placed between the A and the E string, and there's a moment of calm. There's one earlier with the open octave, and now it's very difficult for me to think backwards in music. It's probably similar with text, but I'll play it out of context. There will be enough octaves to come later where you reach a point like this. And when you learn about consonants in music, maybe this is familiar, I'm not sure to how many people it is familiar. The consonant intervals, this was an observation that is credited to the ancient Greeks, Pythagoras specifically, of realizing that the consonant intervals are the ones that have small integer ratios of frequencies. I went on a little bit of a wild goose chase the other day trying to figure out who exactly figured out at what point that sound was vibration and who quantified it and so on. It was a little bit unclear. Credit seems to go back to the Greeks. In any case, the octave is the simplest ratio you can have of 1 to 2. And I suppose this is foreshadowing of the story. This is part of the story that you would get in undergraduate physics, perhaps. It's the idealized vibration of a string. The idealized vibration of the string is like the Fourier transformation of a periodic continuous function. It's this lovely thing where you have you can decompose the vibration of the string into the sum of perfectly spaced overtones, which are integral multiples of the fundamental frequency. The reason I can't resist giving a foreshadowing of the sort of place that I may get to if I won't run out of time the way I'm going, is that this is the idealized string. In the real world, things are quite different. It turns out that strings have not just the longitudinal vibration that is approximated by linear differential equations, but there's torsional vibration, there's transverse vibration, what I meant to say before, longitudinal vibration as well, there is friction. There are a whole lot of complex things that take place in the violin. It turns out that the vibrating string really isn't that as much. So maybe in some future generations who are more sophisticated or are science fiction alien civilizations, they start with Bessel functions and drum membranes and things. It could well be these things turn out to be a lot more complicated. Anyway, sorry, that was the kind of digression that I get into very easily. When I played this in my room and didn't start talking as much, I felt compelled each time to go on to the fugue. And now I'm not sure. I suspect you'd like more music. So I think I will pass from the Adagio onto the fugue. How many of you know what a fugue is, roughly? That's a fair number of people. So the quicker refresher, I'm going to try a little bit like P versus NP. I'm going to give you the shortest description of a fugue ever. What would that be? A fugue is a little bit like a crossword puzzle. For people who like crossword puzzles, I have at least one friend at Green that I engage in those with. Or for the math and computer science people, it's like constraint solving. It's a fun thing. It's a question of fitting puzzle pieces together. Bach was incredibly gifted at doing this, and the fugue is kind of a set piece that shows up for, I'm just thinking of the right order of magnitude here, well, let's say centuries. Centuries of Western classical music. This is kind of, I think this was a thing that people were trained in, and it shows up in the oddest places. In romantic chamber music, for example, Schumann's chamber music, very often the climax of a first movement or a last movement will be a fugue section, and sometimes it becomes kind of ironic, sometimes it's serious, but it's always fun to see how they're put together. The point is that there's a little thing called the subject, which is the first thing you'll hear at the beginning of a fugue. The violin, I should say, is an instrument on which polyphony is highly unlikely. I'll do the proper introduction for the sonatas, if there is such a thing happening in my talk after the fugue. A lot of the rules have to be bent. In this particular case, what I'll say is that the subject, it's not surprising that it's short. In this fugue, this is the subject. That's it. The subject is followed by repetitions. The first repetition will be at an interval of the fifth, sometimes for reasons that have to do with tonality, again, kind of an off tangent. It's not a perfect translation of the subject. It'll be slightly varied. In certain cases, what's called an answer will be accompanied by a counter subject, which is a little secondary theme, which will be consistently used in the rest of the piece. This works much better on the piano where you have more fingers. On a violin, you've only got 4 strings and 4 fingers at most. And so in this case, there usually aren't really well-defined counter subjects. In any case, I won't get into all of the details here. The subjects and the counter and the answers are layered. And there are sections of counterpoint like this, which are the crossword puzzle portions, I'll say. This is where Bach fits together these little fragments of music and makes them fit vertically. And the brilliant thing is that he was obviously a very skilled violinist. He manages to do it in such a way that it doesn't just work musically, but also more critically for me, it somehow just barely works instrumentally. He has to figure out which notes can work on which strings and which positions you can put your fingers in. A big part of playing Bach on the violin is putting your hand into these ridiculous twister kind of things all the time. So it's, twister for one. There are interspersed sections called episodes, which are more loosely inspired. In this particular fugue, just want to give you an example. Like I say, it's hard to fast forward. It continues like this. This is the first episode, just a running series of 16th notes. I think what I find really beautiful about these passages, and it's very difficult to teach, is one has a great deal of leeway and I think also the responsibility to find patterns, to bring out patterns and demonstrate those to the audience. And this is, I think, there's the explicit way that Bach manages to layer multiple stories at the same time in the contrapuntal sections, but there's also a fascinating way that he does it implicitly in these sections, which are superficially monophonic. Superficially, there's only one line. But implicitly, he brings out multiple voices, and The analogy that first comes to mind there is multitasking. If you're into computer science, the beauty of pretending to do several things at the same time by alternating rapidly between them. Kind of a nice thing. I think that's all you really need to know about the fugue right now. I'll play it for you. Not the fugue. Okay. ahead. You see, we end on the same chord again of the G minor. Thank you. I will. This is somewhat reflexive. I think you take any musician, they are so trained that when you applaud, I will bow. So anytime you want me to stop talking, just applaud, I will bow at that point. I promised to tell you a little bit about the pieces just to give you a bit of context. I think I'm running behind the schedule that I anticipated because I always talk more than I think I will. These works, Bach, many of you may know, was born in 1685. And I've read that he was a violinist at the ducal, I don't know how you say that, ducal court? Thank you. Ducal court in Weimar. And it's most likely that he started working on these sonatas already at that time. At least apparently he announced his intentions to do so to some friends. He didn't, however, write a manuscript that is extant until around 1720. There's some early indications of some transcriptions that we have. So basically 1720 is the date that's associated with these works. An interesting side note, I should say 1720 when he was at the court of Köthen, I think it is, and again, a little factoid I learned the other day, the prince there was a Calvinist, so apparently he didn't have much use for music, and this gave Bach a certain amount of spare time to, I guess, clean up his portfolio, if you will. And he wrote this out in longhand. There's something very touching about the title, which I will save for a minute if we get to a movement that I would like to associate it with. So 1720 is when he wrote the clean manuscript, and who knows exactly how long he'd worked on it before that. It wasn't published until 1802. And an interesting thing then is basically these fell into obscurity for at least a century. They were championed by a violinist named Joseph Joachim, who's kind of a big deal in violin history. He was a good buddy of Johannes Brahms. Brahms is a favorite composer of mine. My last CD is of the Sonatas of Brahms. And Joachim championed these pieces and kind of brought them back from obscurity. And so I guess that would have been probably in the 1860s or so. I don't know, I've often read this reference to Joachim bringing them back, but it's not entirely clear to me exactly when that took place. One other anecdote, which is old LP liner worthy, is that I think now I've read that there are 4 or 5 autographs which are taken as the sources that are we triangulate to figure out what Bach originally wrote. And one of them, known as Source D, was found in a set of scrap paper that was destined to be used in a butter shop to wrap butter. So I grew up hearing that story and didn't realize that was only one of a couple copies. It made it much more romantic, of course, the idea that these works were almost lost entirely. I guess that's not the case, but it makes for kind of a cool story anyway. Other storyline. I'm not sure how much I'm going to fit in because I actually would like to play more than speak, and I'm failing a little bit at that. But a little explanation about me in music and math. I'm not sure what's in the biography. So I was born in Vancouver. This is coming back to Vancouver in the last year and a half is really the first I've been back since I left when I was 12. So people sometimes ask, I'm still Canadian, but I've lived most of my life outside of Canada. And quick background, my parents were immigrants from Austria. I grew up with classical music in the household. My mother is a huge fan of music. My father worked as a structural engineer, and so it's almost a little too tidy, but it really works out this way. I have the influence of my 2 parents in my life. And I grew up with math and music, I would say, as my mother tongues. I studied music formally, I guess, from the age of 5 or 6, roughly. My parents like to tell the story of that one of the first things they did when they got to Canada was to buy an upright piano on credit because this was such a novelty coming from Germany at the time that they did. I'm not going to say exactly what year it was. You'll figure it out. It's implicit. If I'm half the age of the 90-year-old, then you know how old I am. My sister, I have an older sister who played piano first. I followed suit. It looked like fun. And I had problems. I guess I didn't like my first piano teacher, so I got a violin for Christmas. This is it's not very interesting. I'm trying to skip ahead to where it gets good. The part I think that first gets interesting for me, well, there are a few observations. One is that one of my earliest memories is of my mother cutting fruit and explaining fractions. And so I think that's a moment of music and math being more or less simultaneous in my life. My mom, I should say, was taking singing lessons at the time, and so I think that was probably the reason that she had a book on rudiments of music. In Canada, there's this wonderful system. I'm curious how does everybody know about the Royal Conservatory of Music in Canada? Yeah, okay. Because that's something that I later would discover is something quite wonderful in this country that doesn't exist in the United States, for example. My parents had what I will always appreciate, the wisdom or intuition that I started studying music theory and history, I guess what would be considered anomalously early. So when I was 5 or 6, I started studying music theory. And my parents, being free-spirited as they were, this went to the extent that you probably know the Parker family, Jackie Parker, John Camor, of course, yeah. His mother, Keiko Parker, over in Burnaby, was my music theory teacher and gave night classes to what seemed like incredibly old people to me. I imagine they were probably high school age, but they seemed really old. And in order for me to take these night classes, my mother summarily decided that I would leave elementary school in the afternoons on those days to take a long nap so I could stay up in the evening. So bless her heart, this is kind of a lovely thing for me. I say this because for me, the grammar, or what I was taught as the rules, if you will, of music, were a part of my life as far back as I can remember. And when I say mother tongue, I mean this in the same way that you think of your native language. Of course, later in life, you learn rules of grammar, you learn rules of syntax and usage and so forth, but this language is transparent to you in some sense. And I don't think it's until you encounter another language and start to ponder the mystery of hearing people emitting these phonemes that are not it's not discernible what the meaning is until the mystery starts to, makes my fingers tingle at least, of what imbues them with meaning. I have this experience now with music a lot of the time, especially as classical music ceases to be as central to our culture or our educational system as it might have been, as it was at one point. I always wonder what other people are hearing. I'm seeing an old philosopher friend here, and so we have kind of an issue here of kind of qualia of what I feel harmony and counterpoint intensely. I'm going to occasionally in these pieces show you some of my favorite passages and kind of what they mean to me, but I don't know whether they make, in some cases, if they make your skin crawl the way they make my skin crawl. I hope so, but I never know. In any case, I grew up learning this and with a sense that there were immutable laws of music. As an illustration, I can say I didn't hear any rock music listening as a kid, and I was probably 10 or 11 when I first heard some rock songs. And I can remember vividly where I was and what I heard because some of them were so novel to me, and especially, this might make some people laugh, but anybody who remembers, at least at one point it was a prog rock band, Yes, The Owner of a Lonely Heart, Parallel Fifths, who would have thought? I didn't know that was possible. Or I can remember being in Victoria, and I can picture the restaurant I was in when, since it's topical and it's in the movies right now, Another One Bites the Dust played, and the guitars played in octaves, and I was like, that's really cool. So this may sound really silly, but it's to say something about how solidly fixed and immutable these laws were for me. And I learned them at the same time that I learned my multiplication tables. And maybe because of this tangible manifestation, this for me, very tactile manifestation of arithmetic for me also had that feeling of this is the way things must be. I never stopped to question it. Absolutely transparent to me. When I went to school here in Vancouver, elementary school, I'll be honest, I don't remember ever working, being in, I think it was in the 7th grade that I had a guidance counselor of whom I remember nothing except that he was a big fan of Ludwig Wittgenstein. I'm putting this in so that I get to make a reference to him later. It's foreshadowing. And he bumped me up into grade 10 math and science, and it still was really easy. And I don't say this in a sense of, it's not that I think that I'm smart. One of the things that I would like to emphasize, maybe it will come up, now I'm sort of forcing it into the talk, is that I very much believe that the notion of simplicity and complexity is relative to your point of view. I don't believe in an absolute notion of simplicity or complexity or of easiness or difficulty, and this is something I think that kind of confounded me all through my early life. People being very admirative of things I was doing and saying, it just seems really easy because it was natural. And I don't know whether it was natural because of a luck of how I was taught. As far as the properties of the number system, of the integers being straightforward, I read an interesting paper the other day about Montessori schooling, which gave me flashbacks. I went to Montessori school. The way in which numbers are made concrete and tactile in Montessori schooling, I think, is something that intrigues me. And so the kinds of things, again, I'm just giving you some allusions because there are too many things that I'd like to touch on but can't. In the philosophy of mathematics, one of the things that really intrigues me right now is the question of why do the axioms of, for example, arithmetic seem natural? Growing up, I never thought twice about it. I never thought that there was anything except the place that many mathematicians seem quite happy to remain, which is a Platonic notion of there are these Platonic ideals. They are simply mirrored in nature and mirrored in our minds. If you want to have a more kind of Kantian look at this. I, much later, was to discover the joy of kind of a formalist way of looking at mathematics, even later at looking at a social constructivist kind of way of looking at how we see the universe. And I think I take music then as a guideline for these counterintuitive, but to me fascinating ideas, that things that seem like they could only be one way, that you can mature or grow into a position of realizing that, my goodness, these are cultural and they're learned and they are things that were inculcated in me through my education, through my experiences, through the linkages between these beliefs and other things. Sorry, that was a rather philosophical tangent. How that links to the G minor sonata. The G minor sonata is something that I played probably when I was 10 or 11 years old. And we're going to see how much time I've got, but I'd like to play the first movements of each of the sonatas. I'd like to play a lot of movements, but I'm talking too much. But the G minor sonata for me, in some sense, if I had to make an analogy, then I would say that this is like a Ptolemaic universe. It's self-contained. It's one in which everything aligns. I made this reference to intonation before. We say that Western music, classical Western music, uses a 12-note scale, as though the 12-note scale were, to use the expression that mathematicians often use, well-defined. One of the fascinating things is it's not. In fact, it's kind of a vague ideal of something that we wish existed, but it doesn't really, it's an unattainable ideal. And this was all later, yet to come in my life, this realization that zero in some sense is not zero, that nothingness is something, that the invention of zero is in fact a radical idea. Here I'm going to make a shout out for a good book. Charles Seife wrote a book called Zero. Very cool. All of this was yet to come. At this point in my life, everything seemed to line up perfectly. These approximations were close enough to be considered, to be treated the same as zero. And there's kind of there's one last musical theory thing that I want to mention just as an illustration. It's this idea of the circle of fifths. How many people know the circle of fifths nowadays? Yeah, pretty good, yeah. The circle of fifths is related to the 12-note scale, this notion that you can keep moving by fifths, and a fifth is defined by the ratio of frequencies being 3 to 2. And if you want to be very quantitative about this for the kind of number crunching types of people, the close coincidence in mathematics is if you take 3 over 2 and you take it to the 12th power, you almost get 2 to the 7, but not quite. Instead, you should get 128, you get, I forgot, it's 129.7 or something. I calculated it just before coming here because I was curious. Music is built in part on allowing for that imprecision, on recognizing that ambiguity is the key to allowing a certain kind of perfection to appear to exist. In terms of the circle of fifths, I used to play piano, and the first invention by Bach is kind of a beautiful stripped down piece of counterpoint If I had a piano, I would play it for you. I used to come home from school, and if my parents weren't around, I would sit at the piano and just goof off for an hour or two and improvise. And one of the sort of thing that I'd like to do was I could never really remember more than the first chunk of the invention that goes from C major to G major. But the fun thing is if you're good at transposing, you can just play the same thing. And you go all the way around the circle of fifths. And this sense of closure, I think, was something that gave me immense satisfaction. The real world was rather chaotic. My family, my household was rather dramatic, let's put it that way. And before I left Canada, before my family left Canada, my father had been out of work for a couple of years. Things were rather helter-skelter, but I think that was the world that I escaped to. I found, much like the fifths and the octaves in the Bach, the entire world of music and the world of mathematics provided a wonderful certainty. It was an absolute rest frame at a time that I believed in that. Let's move on. The next, I'm going to check my timings just to see how far off I am here. Let's see. Yeah, that was only 10 minutes of music and we're an hour in. This is not going well. Well, this might be abridged. My story is that we left Canada so I could study with a teacher in Bloomington, Indiana, by the name of Joseph Gingold. It was a great pedagogue. I mean, he's taught thousands of people. I can't say enough affectionate things about him. By going to Indiana, various circumstances, which again are hard to explain, I ended up at the university as a student when I was 12. It was not what we'd set out for me to do. But I can blame a story which is kind of sweet. My parents never hired babysitters. They used to drop my sister and me at the local library or at bookstores. And I think I was small enough that I could just sort of sit in a bookstore. This was before they had cafes and tables and kind of condoned this sort of thing. When we went to Bloomington and my mother was trying to figure out whether I could take lessons at the music school and how that might possibly work with the university, I ended up at the textbook store that's across the street from the music building in Bloomington and found my way to an undergraduate calculus textbook and basically fell in love and begged my parents to buy it for me. And it was a huge amount of money. It was 30 American dollars at the time my dad had been unemployed for a couple of years. But they bought that for me. And if I have my biblical texts, aside from the Bach, one of them was that. One of them was when I left the school that I attended through grade 7 here in Vancouver. I'm not sure who exactly instigated this, but they gave me a going away present at kind of the class dance goodbye thing, whatever it was, which was an undergraduate physics textbook. And we moved from Vancouver to Indiana in a U-Haul truck, drove across North America with no air conditioning in July. The Midwest is really great for this. The seats were really sticky. But I was happy as a clam because I had a physics textbook in front of me. And by the time the fall rolled around and we tried to figure out where I should go to school, I ended up at the university. And I'm just going to skip how that happened exactly. But I can also credit music because I took placement exams in music. And thank goodness for the Royal Conservatory of Music and my parents' prescience in putting me into that. It turned out that I had covered most of the undergraduate music theory and history, passed out of the exams. Then they found out I was 12, and at that point I kind of got carte blanche. They were like, do whatever you like, take something. And I started signing up for classes, not officially for a degree, because officially I hadn't gotten a high school diploma yet, so I wasn't supposed to be admitted. This turned out to be in my favor as well, because it turns out that when you're not properly admitted, that you can keep taking placement exams, and it's not clear what your status is and whether you have to pay for the credits. So this was very important to my family as well. So I kind of filled in a lot of blanks in my education. When I arrived there, it turned out that the calculus textbook, I fell into the third or fourth year of calculus. My dear old violin teacher from then until the end of his life would tell people that I took advanced calculus. That was all he could ever say about mathematics. I became what I would call a mathematical tourist at that point. Somehow it was so clear that I was preordained, or the family had decided in some sense that I was going to be a musician, that my mathematical and I'll also say computer activity was kind of, the math was not surreptitious. The math was definitely very visible. My playing with computers, which turns out to have been relevant later in my life, that was surreptitious. I took a little bit of everything. I wasn't worried about a job. And I suppose this is something that has been characteristic of my life. I've spent my life doing things which I find beautiful without actually worrying about whether they would be professionally viable or if they could be monetized. But somehow I've had this incredible fortune that I've gotten away with it until now. I'm not sure whether this will continue or not. We'll see. Anyway, the years in Bloomington, Indiana, then I studied mathematics. I took a little bit of everything. I think I started with, as I say, I started with the calculus, then was real and complex analysis, then came algebra, then came topology. Somewhere along the way was, I still remember with great fondness, group theory. This was a point at which this universe, the mathematical universe, opened up hugely. If arithmetic is, as I say, ironically because the integers are infinite. By the way, side note, anybody with math here, I have kind of like, this is comedy night for math people. Are the integers well defined? This is my philosophical question for you. But I don't know if there are any math people here. No. Yes. Okay. I've already asked you that over breakfast. I think you didn't like it very much. Where am I going with this? The mathematical world opened up hugely, but I think some of the things that were come to interest me were just, again, foreshadowed at that point, and I'll just call out a few influences at this point. One was that I remember that the introduction, this was when, I guess the whole 20th century, you can say, was a shifting of mathematics to a focus on set theory. And I remember my group theory textbook specifically starting with a set theoretic view of group theory. And I don't want to say pulling on a shirt tail, but metaphorically asking, but how do you define what a set is? And this turns out to be actually kind of a problem. But that was to come later. Another big influence, an interesting person who was at Bloomington at this time was Douglas Hofstadter, who wrote a book called Gödel Bach, which I have to admit, when I was a teenager, I don't think I really read it yet. People would ask me about it because it hadn't been that long in print. Douglas Hofstadter is a philosopher and cognitive scientist who wrote this wonderfully ebullient book in his 20s, I think, called Gödel Bach. I had a music theory teacher who was, I think Hofstadter was in a music theory class of his, and so he told me, I heard these stories of him showing up with the manuscript and talking about this. He got a Pulitzer Prize and some other prizes for it later. I think of it as essentially being a book about Gödel's incompleteness theorem. That's really the core of it. But there are wonderful allusions made along the way to the works of Bach. There's wonderful wordplay in which he writes dialogues that structurally he mirrors the techniques of Bach. Great fun. And the works of Escher, I think, are they still quite well known, quite popular? I think they had a trend at a certain point. I had a great pleasure this summer of being in Lisbon and seeing what was billed as the world's largest exposition of Escher prints. And so there was a feeling of great fulfillment seeing that. Anyway, mathematics as this grand opening. I want to play for you the opening of the C major sonata, because in a sense, for me, this is almost like a representation of a math text. If the G minor is, as this man Paul Griffith wrote, it has a label, it has an etiquette at the beginning that says, here's the content. Harmonically, it's 1, 2, 5, 1. We're going to be in G minor. It maps out where the piece goes. It leads to a midpoint. Well, there's a midpoint that's the open D octave that I played for you. There's another one which I didn't show you, which is that there's a symmetry in the piece. He comes to the theme in C minor and essentially returns to the opening. And so there's this wonderful bipartite kind of symmetry. If that is, in a sense, a statement of axioms followed by the working out of the theory, and it's a closed world. In the C major sonata, what you have is a dive into something elemental at the beginning, which I can, again, the integers are talismanic for mathematicians. There's a Kronecker quote which I rather like, which he was of the mind, God created the integers, man created all the rest. So they have this kind of significance for mathematicians. The opening of this sonata, I'll just play this first without continuing. is this. And it's literally the first 3 scale degrees, 1, 2, 3. It's like he's building the integers. And the meter that this is in, which is 3/4 time, also you have to remember the numerological significance that this would have had at the time. 3 was the Trinity. I mean, it is C major, which I think anybody who's learned a little bit of the piano knows about middle C as being the grounding, the point that you learn as a kid, or at least that's what I was taught when I was a kid. The thing that I'd like to point out is that it only takes Bach. I assume this was the last of the sonatas that he wrote. The sonata as a whole is the largest and most transcendent to me. When I played these sonatas in Boston, I did the first 2 on the first half and the third sonata on the second half. He was at the height of his craft, and what he manages to do is within 6 or 7 bars, he gets to some place which is harmonically completely unexpected. Literally, he gets to a B major chord. I'll point out what that sounds like, so if you can keep this in your ears. This is where we started, in C major. How he manages to get there in only 8 moves, it's a little bit like a master chess player. Or you can think of it as, if I'm extending my mathematical analogies, this is algebraic topology in some sense. There is a crazy manifold in which he manages to take a few small steps, and he ends up in a part of the space that you just didn't think was accessible.
Which is very Escher.
Which is also very Escher-like, exactly. Because I'm running so late, I'm just going to play up to a cadence of some sort. But I rather like this, and I'm going to use this as the symbol of my years in Indiana. See, we've reached the octave. We're at the dominant now. As I was saying earlier, I don't know what everybody experiences when that's played. I can only tell you, maybe it's annoying if you're not experiencing the same thing that I am. It's something that leaves you in awe. It leaves you in awe at how Bach manages to navigate this space. And if the sense, one of the little details that I didn't mention about the early years in Vancouver is a common thread through my life is teachers who have been very important to me. Teachers, I think, as a surrogate for family. Before I went to Indiana, and the reason I went to Indiana was because I studied with an Australian woman and her husband who lived near Seattle. And she had been an assistant of Joseph Gingold, my future mentor back in the 60s. Gingold, who I obviously have mentioned a few times, was a huge influence on me, and was so because of, I think I would say, especially because of his sheer joy in music. There were people who would come to Indiana and ask, is Gingold great for professional connections or so on? I'd say, no, he's not connected to anybody. He just loves the violin. He loves making music. And he was a great teacher. The couple that I mentioned was a great teacher. A funny quirk I'll mention about them was that, this is just color, but it's entertaining to me. This woman was married to, this Australian lady was married to a man who was 35 years her senior, who was a Jewish man who had escaped the Nazis. He was the only member of his orchestra to escape by hiding below a stage. And lest you think that this story seems disturbingly sexist in some way, after he passed away, she went ahead and married a student of hers who was about 30 years younger than she was, which I thought was a lovely symmetry to the story. I mentioned this because I think all of these in their own way, you can pick out whatever stories you want to. I feel that storytelling, it's fascinating because like picking out notes in a Bach line, you can find the patterns you want to, and you can spin almost any tale you want to. I'm obviously choosing certain things now. The last teacher that I wanted to mention who was a big influence was a teacher I had in the 3rd or 4th grade, I can't remember which, who I think was doing doctoral work, like getting a doctorate in education, and I think I was her test subject or something, it turned out later. But she gave me a lot of extracurricular activity, and one of those things was mythology. I was told, go study some mythology, and I remember another of these fond memories, books that have marked important chapters of my life, was a copy of Bulfinch's Mythology, which I can still remember the cover of this. And so myths, learning about Greek mythology was a very early reference point in my life, and certain mysteries, like how does a god turn into a tree? I think even at that time, I was intrigued by the notion of, well, maybe if you don't really have a fully developed notion of things moving, then things have to transform in place, you know? Interesting things. Anyway, things which influenced me, as I say, music as almost a scientific discipline, one that I was taught there were laws to this. Mathematics as, again, a realm, a space to play in with beings that are perfect and mythological. For me, mathematics is like mythology in that sense. It tells stories about, call them superheroes. It tells stories about things that don't really exist, or at least not in how we experience physical reality, but that we look for these stories because we want to find them. Also, the relative importance of family versus education, the idea that the transmission of culture through education is something akin to family. I've spent most of my life thinking of myself as not religious. I'm not religious in any traditional sense of the word. A little anecdote on this. One of the engagements I had while I was here this term was in Waco, Texas. And it turned out, I think one of the reasons that the symphony in Waco asked me to come was because the music director who works at Baylor University, that is a Baptist university, they were hoping, or they're looking for a violin professor, somebody to work on this department. And what I've been pondering ever since I was there was the fact that he said, well, you know, we'd love to have you come here, but there's a question of, are you a member of a faith tradition? And I said, well, not really. And then I went back to my hotel and almost wanted to call back because I thought, well, okay, I'm going to try not to cuss here. Yes, I am actually. If I've been a scientific materialist for most of my life, this is a faith tradition of sorts. I have my rituals, I have my beliefs, and once you start exploring the metaphor, this is the kind of thing that I'm only talking about because I'm enthusiastic now. I don't usually talk about this in front of even more than one person. But I have to say, I keep getting pulled further and further into this exploration. It's really quite fascinating for me. Sorry, a number of chains of thought. But anyway, yeah, things which influenced me a lot as a child then, therefore, the kind of eschewing nationalism. I have never felt much national identity. I feel quite confused by it. What intrigues me is this tension between what are absolutes and what are learned, and also what, I will say, the subtly implicit social causes for beliefs. I think I spent much of my life thinking that the things that I believed in were absolutes that were somehow not socially driven. And what I come to believe more and more is that not only are these culturally transmitted, but in fact, sometimes the very person-on-person relationships that these are constructed from become visible for me in hindsight. When I see how I wanted to please my teachers or please my parents when I was a child, there's transmission of two sorts going on. One is that there's a set of assumptions, of framing, or a set of lenses for the universe that I inherit that has a story that goes back thousands of years. And there's a story that goes back just to my own childhood of the influences of the people who were around me. And I find reflecting on this very interesting. Anyway, going by time, I should jump ahead. Does anybody want to ask me a question? Because I think we might have to fold the Q&A, and if you want to get to your cheese and wine in time. I can't see, is that 20 past the hour? It is 20 past the hour, right? Yeah. This instrument I actually bought about 20 years ago. I often play on a Strat. The Strat, however, is being repaired right now. It's in Switzerland. And so I could tell you the story of the Strat, or I can tell you, actually there isn't that much to tell about this one. This one's a bit of a tawdry tale. It's an instrument that I've enjoyed a lot. It's made by a maker named Presenda. It was made in Turin in the 1830s. But one of the reasons that I bought it was because a particular violin dealership in Chicago that's associated with a program for lending, for wealthy owners to lend fine instruments to young players, essentially told me that I had to buy an instrument if I wanted to be in the program. So happily it all worked out okay. I like this instrument. I probably overpaid for it. But its story is a little bit more sleazy. Sorry? The Strat, on the other hand, is a lovely story. There's a collector in Switzerland who I knew for a number of years, who attended quite a few of my concerts. And I was at the big music festival in Verbier one summer. This is 14 years ago, goodness. And he asked whether I'd like to come over to his family's chalet and look at a couple violins, which I did, and played on one particular one, which I rather enjoyed. And he asked whether I wanted to play it. And I was quite confused because I wasn't sure, do you mean today for the concert tomorrow? He said, no, I've been thinking about this. I'd like you to play this instrument. And so with no more ceremony than that, I started playing an instrument that I've now played for a decade and a half, I suppose. We swapped violins the next day. We didn't have a double case for me to take back both violins, so I gave him mine, and I took his. That's why I was separated from this instrument for quite a while. And no papers. This is an instrument that I should say not long ago, he mentioned in passing. He said, oh yeah, by the way, somebody offered me 8 million Swiss francs to sell this instrument, but I want you to keep playing it, so I'm not going to sell it yet. Yeah. It's a story which is both heartwarming, and if you get me on a dark day, I'll tell you about the problems of capitalism and the accumulation of wealth, and whether that's really an optimal scenario. But it is what it is. Any more questions? If not, I'll play another. We can probably squeeze in a movement or two, right? Okay, okay. The cheese will still be there, hopefully. I know the Green College crowd is quite rapacious, and there are those who will be eating the cheese without having come to the talk. Shame on them. Oh, goodness. There were two of the slow movements that I would have liked to play from the C major and from the A minor, and now I'm choosing the C major. I'll tell you, this will be surreal without context. It had a nice story because it was going to tell you about another old gentleman that I saw a few weeks ago in Boston, who's had a few strokes and is at the end of his life, and it's a long story. It triggered for me something unusual, which is a rather programmatic interpretation of that movement, which is a beautiful encapsulation of a life in a movement. But I guess you're not going to get that, because instead I'm going to give you the A minor. There's only so much time. The A minor sonata is the one that I was working on most this term because it was new for me. The G minor I learned as a kid, the C major when I was at Indiana. The A minor will forever, henceforth, will be associated with Green College. And this movement is also, it's a beautiful thing. It's very difficult. There are two words. There's one word which comes to mind when I play this movement, and it may sound negative, but I'm kind of delighted by it. It's solipsistic. This movement, for some reason for me, is incredibly poignant in the image I see in it of a person building a world by themselves. And this is where I get to tell the anecdote about the title page of the Sonatas. It's a subtle thing that I read recently and that I haven't been aware of. He wrote in Italian on this copy from 1720, and he wrote sei solo per violino. And the interesting thing is he didn't write sei soli, which would be the grammatically correct Italian, which would mean 6 solos. Sei solo, however, is grammatically correct for you are alone. And people have pointed out that he wrote the date on this cover page, 1720, and that was the year that his wife died. And so you can, of course, you can go where you will with this. I don't want to impose the picture that I have upon you, but as a violinist, it's very difficult to play because these particular lines, it's just physically, it's hard to get this effect to work. It's been quite satisfying to work on it. But I see on the one hand a picture of somebody building a world by themselves, and I suppose I always feel a little bit sensitive about this because I've spent a lot of my life building a world in my own head. And another picture, perhaps, maybe this is more Edgar Allan Poe-esque for you, there's a pulsing line at the bottom. Perhaps this is the heartbeat of the composer. Or it could be the heartbeat of the beloved. I mean, another image that came to mind today as I was playing on a more cheerful note is of caressing somebody and feeling their pulse. Anyway, I don't want to give you too many associations. It's a lovely piece if I can manage to play it. This one is labeled, it's marked Andante, which means at a walking pace. afraid I've abridged it a bit. Each half is repeated normally, but I'm trying to save time. And since I'm saving time, it probably means I won't be telling you about what I'm working on these days, which part of it is in music, and part of it is in computer science, and part of it is in philosophy. I'm a little bit scattered into a lot of areas. But I figure I should play for you one of the final movements. All I want to say with that is that the world is really a beautiful place filled with fascinating things. And if this depicts the enthusiasm I have for what's out there, then that's all I can try to do. Oh, I forgot. I actually do have a joke with this one. I have to tell you this one, just because it made me laugh a few weeks ago. I mentioned Wittgenstein. I promised to get back to him. There was a phase when I was in Indiana when I took a lot of books out of the library where I was trying to figure out how really interesting ideas or things that I thought were interesting, just what forms they were put into. And this means Newton's Principia Mathematica and Galileo's dialogue of the two world systems and Thomas Kuhn and so on. And one of the books that I took out of the library was this Tractatus Logica Philosophus that Wittgenstein wrote when he was 20 or something. And it's kind of charming and hilarious. Like he had it figured that he had figured out all of philosophy, wrote this book, and then went off and he was a gardener at a monastery for a while, and it did a couple other funny things. I'm trying to remember. Aside from the gardening, there was something else he did. I feel like you would know this, but no, okay. In any case, the last line of this Tractatus, it attempts to be kind of like a Euclid for philosophy. He figured he had it all figured out. It was basically, the world consists of facts. There are objects. They have properties. It kind of goes on like this, like a math proof. And the last line is infamous because he says, whereof we cannot speak, we must remain silent. And I guess his point was that he lived in a world that was, one that I've often fallen into the trap of thinking that world is just about language, that everything is defined by language. I feel that sometimes that is the case. As I mentioned, in mathematics, I'm a formalist. I believe that we're manipulating symbols, and yes, maybe there's culture that determines which rules we use and so on. There's a lot of side notes there. The thing that amused me is that Wittgenstein apparently was a quite good clarinetist, and he had an older brother who was a very accomplished pianist, in fact. Exactly. Commissioned a bunch of works for left hand alone because he lost an arm in the Second World War. And the thing that struck me that was so funny was how Wittgenstein, being a musician, coming from a musical family, how he could write that and not think of music. Or maybe he did, and maybe there's an in-joke there that at least I haven't seen anybody else point out. Anyways, I figured that was a way to end a talk by saying, one doesn't have to be silent. I can play you a piece of music. I'll just shut up. Now I just have to choose one of these last movements. Because it's the one that I dedicate to Green, since I learned it here, this is the last movement of the A minor sonata. Thank you. Thanks.